Boldwood presents Snowflakes over Starr's Fall, written by Kate Hewitt and read by Kate Hanford. Chapter 1. Jenna Miller didn't like the look of the guy as soon as he walked into her store. Popped collar on his polo shirt, cable-knit golfing sweater draped over his shoulders, the gold and silver links of a Rolex glinting on one tanned and muscular wrist. He slid expensive-looking aviator sunglasses onto his forehead, ruffling his nut-brown hair as he glanced around at her store with narrowed eyes that flashed ice blue, lips already pursed in obvious disdain. Jerk. Her shoulders had tensed, creeping toward her ears as she stilled by the cash register where she'd been going through yesterday's receipts. It was a Saturday morning in June, the dust motes dancing through the drowsy air, caught by the warm sunlight. A perfect summer's day. Although Jenna was already thinking about new stock, whether she should get in anything for fall or even Christmas. She'd sold some fresh evergreen wreaths last year that had done pretty well, and she knew she always had to be thinking ahead. But on this summer's morning, she'd been enjoying the peaceful solitude of the store. It was only 8:30, and she hadn't had any customers yet. Not that she'd had all that many lately, something that she was trying not to think about too much. Miller's Mercantile was a staple of Starr's Fall. It had been offering an array of basic groceries and hardware for over 40 years. That wasn't going to change. Not on her watch, even if fewer and fewer people were coming through her doors. This man was, she told herself, a potential customer, and that was a good thing. She'd make sure it was. He took a few steps into the store, glancing around, his lips now turning down in what was obviously dismay, or maybe even disgust. Clearly, he was disappointed by what was on offer. Jenna glanced around at the beloved and well-worn wooden shelves of admittedly slightly tired-looking grocery staples. Bags of flour and sugar, cans of soup and beans, buckets of nails and screws. She'd added a few kitschy but appealing touches here and there, a barrel of pickles swimming in brine by the front door, an old popcorn machine. She offered every customer a free bag of popcorn. At least she did when she was able to get the machine working. It had been broken for a while, leaving a smell of stale popcorn and old oil in the air. But she wasn't sure people liked popcorn that much anyway. Maybe she'd get rid of it. The man still hadn't spoken. Jenna wasn't even sure if he'd seen her. He stood in the middle of the store, about 15 feet away, his hands on his hips as he continued to survey its offerings. Just yesterday, Jenna had arranged a display of boxes of pasta on the end of an aisle. She thought it looked appealing, with a red and white checkered tablecloth and the boxes stacked in a little pyramid. She watched as the man surveyed the little display, his lip curling before he flicked his gaze away. He tucked one hand in the pocket of his Nantucket red khakis as he strolled past the display in leather boat shoes without socks. Everything about him blared high-powered city type on a jaunt to the country, the exact kind of person Jenna tended to loathe, from far too much previous experience with one man in particular who was pretty much exactly like this one. Ryan had been younger, admittedly, and a bit flashier, but still, the two were cut from the same unfortunate cloth. Still, Jenna told herself, this guy was a potential customer, and she knew how to be polite. "May I help you?" she asked, in what she believed was a pleasant and friendly tone, as the man continued to survey her store, his eyes narrowed. Slowly, he turned to face her. Jenna experienced a jolt then, unexpected and unwelcome, of awareness. Physical awareness, Because, fine, the man was handsome. Hot, even. Something she hadn't noticed when she'd been dissecting his clothing choices and deciding she didn't like him. Which she could admit was a tad judgmental of her. Maybe even a lot judgmental. Something she didn't like to think she was. But it was hard when this guy still hadn't spoken to her, as if she wasn't worthy of his notice when he was in her store. Now, his ice blue eyes widened a fraction as he stared at her, seeming to take in her appearance and make his judgments, just as she had with him. And she wasn't at all sure she liked that. She watched as his gaze raked slowly over her from head to toe, causing her cheeks to heat because, for heaven's sake, that look was thorough, and not in a good way. And all right, fine. She knew she might not be at her best. She didn't get gussied up for a Saturday morning in the store. Her hair was in 2 long Pippi Longstocking-like braids, and she'd paired a flannel shirt, the sleeves hacked off, with a pair of old overalls with bright purple patches on the knees and butt. It was the kind of hippie lumberjack look she liked to embrace. But right now, underneath this man's scornful stare, she felt something close to embarrassment, and it made her furious. How dare he make her feel that way? How dare she let him? And he still hadn't spoken. "Hello?" Jenna asked, her tone turning the teeniest bit pointed. "Do you need something?" The man jangled some keys in his pocket as he arched one dark eyebrow. I don't suppose you have smoked salmon in a place like this." Smoked salmon? A place like this? Indignation fizzed through Jenna, and she felt herself readying for a fight before she took a deep breath and managed to rein her temper back in. It was a fair question, she told herself, even if it didn't feel like one. She knew she was a little sensitive about any criticism of Miller's Mercantile, because her brother Zach had been criticizing it for months, if not years. He wanted to gentrify the store, offer expensive candles and artisan cheeses and cashmere blankets and who knew what else. So far, Jenna had held him off from turning the store into some kind of pretentious boutique, but the store's account books suggested something had to change. Not like that, though. "No," she answered in a clipped tone. "I'm afraid we don't. But we do have some canned tuna." The man's nostrils flared, and even though his expression was one of scorn, Jenna felt that jolt of awareness again. Why did he have to be so good-looking? Those bright blue eyes, the thick, wavy hair, its brown strands looking gold in some places where they caught the sunlight. He had the chiseled cheekbones of a male model and the muscled physique of a rugby player. Generic, she told herself dismissively. He could be any boring, blank-faced model on the cover of a Ralph Lauren catalog. Big deal. "Tuna?" he repeated disbelievingly. "I'm not going to put canned tuna on my toasted sourdough." Jenna let out a bark of scornful laughter before she could help herself. "Of course you're not," she agreed. "Well, if you'd like a breakfast alternative, may I suggest cornflakes? Very healthful. We do carry those. Or eggs?" She tried to moderate her tone because she realized she was sounding a little snarky. Scrambled eggs on sourdough are delicious. Or so I've heard." He raised both eyebrows then, his mouth quirking, looking amused in a disdainful way. This man had really cornered the market on smug superiority. "You've never eaten sourdough?" he surmised. What a surprise. Wow. He'd turned toasted sourdough into an insult. Jenna shook her head. He infuriated her, but Weirdly, some small part of her was almost enjoying the exchange, the pointed intensity of it. "Welcome to Hicksville, Mr. Manhattan," she quipped. "Are you here on vacation?" She widened her eyes in mock dismay, resting one hand on her cheek. Were the Hamptons overbooked? His mouth twitched in something almost like a smile, although his icy eyes flashed with ire. "Let me guess. You've never been there?" he replied dryly. He jangled the keys in his pocket again. "Is there any other grocery store in this town?" "Nope." She smiled sweetly. "If you want smoked salmon, I'd suggest the deli in Litchfield. It's only half an hour away. I bet your Porsche could make it there in 20 minutes. He laughed, a bark of genuine amusement as his eyes glinted with something like appreciation. "How did you know I have a Porsche?" Her smile widened, Grinch-like. "Just a guess." They stared at each other for a long moment. A face-off. Jenna kept his gaze and did her best to ignore the alarming flutters in her middle. So he was good-looking. There were plenty of good-looking guys who were jerks. She'd had intimate experience with one in particular. Then he dropped his gaze and shook his head as he looked around the store once more. I don't feel like going all the way to Litchfield," he told her, an edge entering his voice. "So I guess I'll have to make do with whatever you've got in this place." Somehow the way he said "this place" made her hackles rise again. He sounded so brutally dismissive. "Breakfast items are in the far aisle," she informed him stiffly. "Let me know if you need help finding anything else." She stocked orange juice in the admittedly small freezer section, but somehow she doubted this man wanted concentrate from a can, the kind you scooped out with a spoon and mixed with water. No doubt, for him, it was freshly squeezed from oranges flown in from Florida that very morning, or nothing. Pressing her lips together, she turned back to the cash register and its receipts. Jenna listened to his footsteps as he headed toward the far aisle, the weathered floorboards creaking under his boat shoes. He muttered something under his breath, and she thought she caught the word unbelievable. It was followed by a snort of something like disgust, which made her tense up, but she told herself she was not going to descend to his level. She'd be perfectly civil when he came back with his cornflakes, or whatever subpar item he'd chosen, because he couldn't have smoked salmon on his toasted sourdough. Good grief. The guy was practically a parody of the overprivileged city type, and of course he had no idea that he was. He'd be asking for avocados next, along with tomato juice and a celery stick for his Bloody Mary. Jenna continued counting yesterday's receipts, only realizing she had not kept any of the amounts in her head when the man returned and thumped a box of generic brand cornflakes onto the counter with more effort than was needed. "These expired 2 months ago," he informed her flatly. A flush rose to Jenna's face. She tried hard to check everything she stocked was within date, and she glanced at the top of the box. April of that year, clearly stamped on top. Oh dear. "I'm sorry about that," she told him as politely as she could. "Did you see any other boxes that were in date?" In reply, the man simply shrugged, and Jenna bit the inside of her cheek before continuing in the same solicitous tone. "Why don't I go check that for you?" She slipped out from behind the counter, conscious of the man's silent stare on her retreating back, the purple patches on her butt feeling very noticeable all of a sudden, as she headed back to the breakfast section of the store. It only took one glance at the cereal boxes stacked on the shelves to realize he must have taken one from the very back of the shelf. Every other box she saw was in date. What a jackass. She took one of the in-date boxes and returned to the cash register, placing it on the counter with a little more force than necessary. "There we are," she announced. She discovered she could still sound sweet while gritting her teeth. "This one doesn't expire until next year, just like all the other boxes on the shelf. You must have found the only one that was expired." She flicked her gaze to his to find him eyeing her with something like a smirk. "How unlucky of you." "It wouldn't have happened if you kept track of your stock," he answered shortly. "Considering the size of this place, it shouldn't be too hard." Before Jenna could reply to that zinger, he nodded toward the receipts. "You don't have a computer, I'm guessing? Or even a calculator in this place?" There were those 3 words again. In this place. Like she was living in a hovel. "Actually, I do my adding up on an abacus," Jenna returned dryly as she rang up his box of cereal. "And I scratch the numbers into a stone tablet. That will be $2.65. "I wouldn't be surprised," the man returned as he handed over a platinum American Express card that had some heft to it. In fact, it wasn't even made of plastic, like any normal credit card. She took a not-so-secret pleasure in handing it straight back to him. "I'm afraid I don't take American Express." He let out a huff of disbelieving laughter, scowling at the same time. "Why am I not surprised?" "I don't know," Jenna replied sweetly. "Why aren't you?" He shook his head slowly in seeming disbelief. "Do you treat all your customers this way?" "Only the rude ones." The words slipped out before Jenna could stop them. Okay, she needed to remember he was a customer, no matter how obnoxious he seemed. She took a deep breath and let it out. "Sorry," she managed grudgingly. "But you got my back right up with your snotty attitude about my store." As far as apologies went, she realized, hers had pretty much sucked. "Do you have another credit card?" Wordlessly, his mouth compressed, which somehow emphasized his lean cheekbones, he handed over another credit card. "Are you here on vacation?" Jenna asked, as she put the credit card through the machine, which was ancient and usually took several minutes. But most people in Starr's Fall used cash. At least at her store, and the ones who used card didn't mind having a few minutes chit-chat while their card was approved. It was practically a ritual. Not this guy, apparently. He was still scowling as he replied in a clipped voice. "Nope, not on vacation." "Visiting someone?" she asked, a little too hopefully. "Please don't let him be." "Actually," he informed her coolly, "I moved here a couple of days ago." For a second, Jenna couldn't keep the horror from her face, and the man noticed. "That's quite the welcome," he replied, with a rasping, humorless chuckle. "And I thought country folk were meant to be friendly, helping each other out and all." "Maybe don't buy into corny stereotypes," she shot back, and he shook his head. "There's no pleasing you, is there? Well, don't worry, it's not like I'm going to try. You won't catch me in this dump a second time. Litchfield it is." He drew himself up as he finished. "Frankly, I'd travel all the way back to New York to avoid encountering such a... He paused, clearly at a loss, while Jenna stared at him, wondering what on earth he was going to say. "Such a shrew like you again," he finished, a little uncertainly, like he wasn't sure he'd landed on the right word. A shrew? Jenna didn't know whether to be outrageously offended or scornfully amused. "What are you, Shakespeare?" she added. And he just blinked at her for a second before he remembered to glare. Amusement gave way to anger as she glared back. If he never darkened her door again, it would be too soon. All right, she could have been a little friendlier, but he'd been sneering at her store from the moment he'd crossed the threshold. Stupid city idiot. They were all alike. At least you treat them all the same. She pushed that little voice away as the man suddenly burst out in exasperation. How long does that damned machine take? It's just about finished, Jenna informed him icily. She took the card out of the machine, glancing at the name on its front. Jack A. Wexler. She thrust the card at him as the receipt began to print out. Another laborious process. Would you like the receipt? No, he stated flatly, and without another word, he grabbed his box of cornflakes and marched out of the mercantile, making sure the screen door banged hard behind him. Jerk, Jenna muttered to no one. Saying it out loud didn't make her feel much better. She glanced back at the pile of receipts and then pushed them away, annoyed as much at herself as at Jack Wexler. Well, almost. She knew she shouldn't have been so snippy, rising to his stupid bait time and time again. But men like him really got her back up. Privileged, arrogant, so sure of their own effortless charms. And she wasn't stereotyping, she told herself, even though she knew she pretty much was. But Jack Wexler had shown his colors several times over in the space of 10 minutes. At least if he made good on his promise, she'd never see him again. Although she had to wonder why an obvious city type like him had moved to Starr's Fall. It was far off the beaten track when it came to ex-Manhattanites. They usually didn't venture past Litchfield, and they thought that was the boonies. Never mind. She was putting him, out of her mind right now. There was enough to be occupying her time anyway, dealing with the store. Now that her brother Zach had started his own furniture restoration business out of the back barn, Jenna managed the mercantile pretty much on her own, which was how she liked it. Zach had struck out on his own because he hadn't felt the store was big enough for the both of them. And in truth, it hadn't been. Jenna knew she might have been the teeniest bit controlling when it came to managing this place, but it was because it mattered so much to her. And it was all she had. Which was a somewhat depressing thought, and not one she wanted to dwell on overmuch. She was 39 years old, and Miller's Mercantile was pretty much her life. Not her whole life, of course. She had a great group of friends. In fact, she was meeting Annie Lyman for dinner tonight at Starr's Fall's only diner, the Starlight. And then there was Lori and Liz and Maggie and Zoe. But why was she thinking this way? As if she had to add up all the good things in her life like a column of numbers, making sure the profits were more than the costs. It was stupid Jack Wexler, Jenna knew, being so scornful about her store and sneering at her, calling her a shrew of all things, like something out of Shakespeare. That had been some serious misogyny there, and none of it was any reason to feel like her life was lacking, because it wasn't. So, Jenna told herself, she simply wasn't going to think about him anymore. A couple of hours later, her equanimity was mostly restored. Stacking shelves, ordering inventory, chatting with a few friendly customers, familiar faces she knew and liked. It all grounded her in the reality of her life, which she enjoyed. She liked being part of this community. She enjoyed being known. She'd chosen to come back to Starr's Fall after a whirlwind year in San Francisco and 2 more miserable years in New York, attempting to make a dead-on-arrival relationship work. And this town had helped to heal her. Jack Wexler might think he was above her country ways, but she'd had her time in the city too, and she'd turned her back on it for good. But why was she thinking about Jack Wexler again? By late afternoon, the store was empty, the summer air still and drowsy, and Jenna pulled out her laptop. She had all her accounts on a spreadsheet like any normal, business-minded person of this century. She just liked counting the receipts, seeing the tangible evidence of her profits, something she wished she'd mentioned to Jack Wexler. To work on the store's website. Her friend Lori, who ran Max's Place, Starr's Fall's new pet store and bakery, had convinced her that she needed one. "Everybody looks online first, Jenna," she'd told her. "You have to have a presence." And so Jenna was, slowly and painfully, navigating her way through one of those websites from a box jobs, pointing and clicking and trying to make it look personalized. It was, she'd discovered, a lot harder than Lori had made it sound. But she knew she needed to make some changes to how she ran things, and a website was one she could handle. After an hour of tinkering, she went on Google to see if the website came up in the search for Miller's Mercantile. Lori had said that search engine optimization was important, and Jenna could see why. She wasn't a complete technophobe, after all. She scrolled as much as the next person, but making websites felt like a whole other level. As she scrolled down through the hits, an article in the Litchfield County Times when they'd had their 25th anniversary years ago, she suddenly stilled as 6 words jumped out at her. Worst store in the whole area. It was a review on TripAdvisor, and it had been made that morning. Sucking in a hard breath, she clicked on it and read the single scathing paragraph. "Went here for some basic groceries, but never again. Store is badly stocked with subpar items that are past their expiration date, and the woman at the counter was one of the rudest and most unpleasant people I have ever encountered, insulting me personally multiple times and for no reason. I moved to Starr's Fall for the community and was sorely disappointed by one of my first experiences of it. Hopefully, someone in the town will start another grocery store and put Miller's Mercantile out of business, as it surely deserves. If I could give it less than 1 star, I would have. Do not recommend." Jenna blinked, reeling from what felt like an intensely personal attack. She felt both hurt and painfully exposed, like Jack Wexler, because he had obviously written the review, even if the username was simply a concerned resident, had peeled back a layer of her skin. All right, she'd been snippy, but then so had he. Could he not see that? Of course he couldn't. The hurt, she had tears stinging in her eyes, and she never cried, was fast morphing into a far more comforting fury. Anger she could do, especially when she was not in the wrong. At least, not as much as Jack A. Wexler made her out to be. Pursing her lips, Jenna typed out a response to the review. "I'm so sorry you had such a negative experience, Mr. Wexler, but perhaps next time you could make fewer offensive comments about my person, my business, and my inventory before you've barely crossed the threshold. Amazingly, you managed to find the 1 box of expired cereal in the entire store. I hope you found your smoked salmon, zooming over to Litchfield in your Porsche, while this shrew, as you called me, continues to serve the good people of this wonderful community." She pressed publish before she could overthink it, smiling grimly as it appeared on the screen. This, Jenna thought, was war. Chapter 2. By the time Jenna was walking into the starlight that evening, she found she was still fuming. although she was trying to hide it. She'd stopped by Your Turn Next, the town's new board game cafe, to rant about Jack Wexler to her brother Zach and his new girlfriend, Maggie, who ran the place. Unfortunately, she'd had an uncomfortable feeling they'd been more amused than outraged on her behalf, which was incredibly aggravating. All right, Zach, of all people, knew she had something of a temper. He'd been living with her for pretty much his whole life. But they hadn't seen and heard just how obnoxious Jack Wexler had been. She also hadn't told them about the 1-star review online, because she'd been too annoyed, as well as embarrassed. Miller's Mercantile had few enough online reviews as it was, so Jack Wexler's 1 star had seriously lowered her overall rating. Considering she was trying, albeit not as hard as she could or even should be, to attract new business, this development was fairly worrying. And yet she knew there was nothing she could do about it. Let it go, Jenna told herself for the umpteenth time. But the problem was that review was still up there. And as long as it was, she knew she would feel furious, along with stupidly hurt, which made her feel even more furious. Why should a man she barely knew have that kind of power over her? She'd worked long and hard to make sure no man had that over her ever again, and it was incredibly aggravating that a stupid stranger did. There was no winning, she reflected gloomily. She just hoped Jack Wexler steered clear of her, because she was certainly going to steer clear of him. Her friend, Annie Lyman, was already seated in a deep vinyl booth in Starr's Fall's only diner when Jenna arrived. Rhonda, the owner, pouring coffee from behind the counter, gave Jenna a wink and a wave as she came in. "The usual for you girls," she called, and Jenna smiled a little tiredly. Her usual was a gin and tonic, and she felt she was going to need it. "Thanks, Rhonda," she called back, and slid into the booth opposite Annie, who was perusing the menu avidly, even though Jenna was pretty sure she also ordered the same thing every time, a double bacon cheeseburger with extra fries. "Hey," she said gently. "How are you?" Annie's mom, Barb, had been diagnosed with Parkinson's just over a year ago, and she'd been steadily declining ever since. It was heartbreaking to watch her friend's mother slowly but surely lose her abilities. Fine motor skills had gone first, then speech, and then walking. She'd moved into hospice care just a few weeks back, a pale shadow of herself, although, amazingly, still in good spirits. The last time Jenna had visited her, Barb hadn't been able to speak or even lift her head from the pillow, but she'd smiled. And that beatific curving of her lips had just about broken Jenna's heart. The palliative nurses thought it was likely to be no more than a matter of months. Jenna knew Annie was finding it incredibly tough. She and Barb had run Lyman orchards together for the last 10 years, ever since her dad had died. They were best friends as much as they were mother and daughter. Annie had always been fiercely protective of Barb, and watching her suffer, without being able to do anything about it, had to be tearing her apart. "Well, you know," Annie answered Jenna's gentle question as she pursed her lips, her gaze fixed on the menu. "Could be better. Could be worse, I guess." Her lips trembled for a second until she pressed them together. "It is what it is." Grief, Jenna thought, had to be hard no matter what form it came in, or how much time you had to prepare yourself for it. Not that she'd experienced this particular kind of grief. Her own parents were fit and well, living in Florida, having retired from running Miller's Mercantile 4 years ago. And not that she'd grieve them all that terribly if they were gone. Which was a horrible way to think, but there it was. They'd been emotionally absent from her life for a long time now. There had been no big drama or hostility, just what had felt like a lukewarm love on their part that had drifted into a vague indifference on both sides as she'd grown older. Her parents had had far more interest in each other and their business than the two children they'd raised. At least it had always felt that way to Jenna, and never more so than when she'd limped back from New York, a shadow of herself, and her parents hadn't even noticed how much she'd been hurting. She grieved the relationship she'd never had with them, she supposed, but that was a different kind of pain, more like a scar than a wound, and one she was well used to. "Tell me something funny that happened to you today," Annie commanded abruptly. When she looked up from the menu, her eyes gleamed with unshed tears, and Jenna's heart ached for her. She'd been friends with Annie since she'd been tiny. Although Annie was a few years older than her, they'd always got along. And when they'd both settled in Starr's fall, two decidedly single women in their 30s, they developed an even stronger bond. Although Annie wasn't single anymore, Jenna reminded herself a little morosely. She'd started dating Mike the mechanic back in April. You could spot them a mile away, as Mike was 6'4" and Annie nearing 6 feet, both with full heads of wild gray hair. They were simultaneously the most improbable and perfect couple ever. "Something funny?" she repeated musingly. The only thing Jenna could think about that happened today was her unfortunate encounter with Jack Wexler, and that definitely hadn't been funny. But maybe she could make it funny, for her friend's sake. "Well," she began, propping her elbows on the scarred table, "I met the biggest jackass in all of northwestern Connecticut today. Does that count as funny?" "Only if he did something stupid rather than annoying," Annie quipped with a wobbly smile. "Did he?" "If you count asking for smoked salmon in Miller's Mercantile as stupid, then yes. He wanted it for his toasted sourdough, would you believe?" Annie let out a gurgle of laughter. "Toasted sourdough? Did he seriously say that?" Jenna nodded, heartened by Annie's incredulity. "Yep." "That's both stupid and annoying," Annie decided. "Was he rude about it?" "So rude," Jenna replied decisively. She found she was enjoying this retelling of the whole Jack Wexler episode. Instead of coming across furious and, well, shrewish, she reimagined herself having risen above it, for Annie's sake. "This guy practically has privilege tattooed on his forehead," she continued, settling into her story. "You should have seen the clothes he was wearing. Boat shoes, the popped collar, the Rolex, the sweater thrown over his shoulders, and he drives a Porsche. Like, try not to be so basic, dude. We get you're rich, you don't need to scream it." "Good grief." Annie shook her head, her eyes glinting with amusement, which made Jenna feel a whole lot better. She would gladly throw Jack Wexler to the wolves for her friend's sake. And after all, hadn't he done the same thing to her by writing that horrible review? The memory of it still made her burn, even as she was trying to make light of the whole thing for Annie. "So, did he just storm out of the store or what?" Annie asked. "He bought some cornflakes because he said he couldn't be bothered to go all the way to Litchfield, but he kept calling the store this place like it was some dirt-floored hovel, and he told me he'd never come back. He also called me a shrew before he slammed the door on the way out and roared off in his Porsche." She didn't actually know if he'd roared off or not, but it sounded about right. Annie shook her head, marveling at Jack Wexler's sheer nerve. "A shrew? Seriously? What a jerk." That's not even the worst of it, Jenna continued, leaning forward. The wound was still raw, but she needed to tell someone, and Annie was her best friend. He wrote a 1-star review on Google, absolutely trashing the place. And he had been the rude one. Annie's eyes widened. Okay, now he sounds like a total ass, she stated definitively. Nothing funny about that. Is he here on vacation? For a second, Jenna hesitated, as she recalled, slightly uncomfortably, that Jack Wexler lived in Starr's Fall now. He was, more or less, her neighbor, and she wasn't one to create bad blood. But he'd started it, and he'd written that review, even if she'd been a little rude in return. He'd just moved here, she admitted. Unfortunately. Who just moved here? Rhonda asked as she plopped down 2 generous gin and tonics onto their table. And why is it unfortunate, may I ask? Do you eavesdrop on everyone's conversations? Jenna teased, smiling. Or just ours? Oh, everyone's, Rhonda informed her airily, but only if they're interesting. So, who you trash-talking, girls? Should I be concerned? Just this big jerk who's moved to Starr's Fall, Annie told her with relish. Clearly she was enjoying having something to focus on other than her dying mom. But Jenna experienced a slight twinge of unease at the thought of spreading such notions when Jack Wexler had only just moved here. But then she remembered that wretched review, and she hardened her heart. He deserved every bit of it and more. Oh? Rhonda's penciled-in eyebrows improbably rose. And what big jerk is this? This guy who came into Miller's Mercantile, Annie said. And Jenna tried not to wince at the sound of her friend's voice ringing out through the whole restaurant. What was his name, Jenna? Fine. The die was cast, and he really did deserve it. Jack Wexler. Annie nodded solemnly. He's some blowhard from the city who complained about Miller's Mercantile because it didn't have smoked salmon. She rolled her eyes, her salt and pepper curls bouncing around her flushed face. 2 sips of gin and tonic, and her friend was already well on her way to a serious buzz, Jenna noted with affection. Annie had never been able to hold her liquor, and Jenna suspected she needed a bit of liquid relief at the moment. Jack Wexler, Rhonda mused. I'll make a note of it if he comes in here. If my Eggs Benedict isn't good enough for him, then I don't know what is. He gave Jenna's store a 1-star review online because of it, Annie continued boisterously. And this time, Jenna did wince. She didn't really want that information spread around for the sake of her store, rather than Jack Wexler. Now that does sound like a jerk, Rhonda agreed, her eyes narrowing. Of the first order. I know how much a 1-star review can hurt, trust me. I had some jackass in here once who 1-starred me because I didn't give free refills on wine. She planted a hand on one bony hip, her peroxide blonde ponytail flipped over her shoulder. Maybe I should ban this Jack Wexler from the premises. If he's going to be the type to look down his nose at every joint in this town. He is, Annie insisted, taking another sip of her drink. He certainly sounds like it. Jenna was starting to feel slightly alarmed. As much as she disliked Jack Wexler, she didn't want to be accused of blackballing him in all of Starr's Fall before he'd barely set foot in the place. Plus, she had a feeling that would just make him double down on trash-talking her store. I'm not sure, she began. No Jack Wexlers allowed, Rhonda crowed with a cackle that ended in a smoker's cough, and Annie actually applauded. She had good friends, Jenna thought. Dear, loyal friends. But maybe they'd taken this a touch too far, both for her sake and because Annie was clearly in desperate need of a distraction, and Jack Wexler was it. Well, he has moved here, so maybe we should be a little, she began feebly, only for the words to die on her lips as she caught who was coming through the starlight's swinging doors. His ice-blue eyes narrowed in now familiar derision. Sunglasses slipped up onto his forehead just as before, even though it was nearing dusk. Oh, no. What? Annie asked, taking in the undoubtedly horrified expression on Jenna's face. Then she followed her frozen gaze to the man still standing in the doorway, surveying the diner like a king might survey his domain. Oh, Annie breathed. That's him. It must be. He looks like a jerk. Is it? Rhonda craned her neck to clock Jack in the doorway, her eyes narrowed in preemptive scorn. Well, I'll tell him right now what I think of him. She started to sashay over to him, and swiftly Jenna grabbed her arm. She could not be responsible for running a new resident out of town, even one as odious as Jack Wexler. Rhonda, he's a customer, she hissed. And if you antagonize him, he's just likely to give you a bad review too. I'd like to see him try. Plus, Jenna whispered as a flush crawled up her throat, I might have been a little rude to him. Just a little. You? Annie scoffed disbelievingly. Rude? Rhonda, however, hesitated, which was a little humbling. Well, I'll see what he's like, she groused. But he's out on his ear if there are any complaints, let me tell you. Jenna watched, feeling a jumbled mixture of anticipation and trepidation, as Rhonda strode toward her newest customer. He'd changed from his ensemble earlier and was now wearing a gray quarter-zip fleece that looked expensive and very new, paired with similarly crisp-looking jeans. He'd also exchanged his boat shoes for a pair of hiking boots, also clearly new. He'd probably taken the price tags off that morning, Jenna thought cynically. He was so much of a city boy, it was kind of ridiculous. He was, she noticed, still gazing around the diner with the same narrow-eyed assessment to which he'd subjected Miller's Mercantile. May I help you? Rhonda's voice rang out, sounding more than a little aggressive, and Jack jerked back a little, clearly startled by her tone. Oh dear. Jenna knew Rhonda was a little defensive of her. Years ago, when she'd first limped back to Starr's Fall with a broken heart, wounded pride, and a soul-deep cynicism that all men had to be lying cheats, Rhonda had commiserated with her over a bottle of wine late at night in this diner, the sign flipped to closed. Jenna couldn't remember half of what she'd blubbed to Rhonda, 2 or 3 glasses in, and she cringed a little now to think of it, because she tended to keep her emotional cards close to her chest. Rhonda, however much a gossip she liked to be, hadn't let Jenna's secret slip. At least, Jenna hoped she hadn't. Just like she hoped Rhonda didn't make Jack Wexler Starr's Fall's public enemy number 1, even if he deserved to be. She told herself she was going to rise above his slurs and sneers, but right now it was feeling like she hadn't at all. She might have even brought the whole episode a little lower. I was hoping for a table, Jack told Rhonda, in a voice that bordered on Arctic. If that's not too much to ask. And will you give me a 1-star rating if it is? Rhonda returned, in the same aggressive tone, and Jenna closed her eyes. Rhonda was known for refusing customer service, it was true, but she usually waited until they'd first done something objectionable. Sensing someone's gaze on her, Jenna opened her eyes to find Jack Wexler staring right at her, his narrowed gaze like a laser, freezing her in place. Jenna felt as if her heart had stopped beating, the whole world had stopped moving, as they stared straight at each other for several long beats. Then, Jack snapped his gaze back to Rhonda, and Jenna tried to remember how to breathe. "I don't think I'll bother," Jack replied, his cut glass tone carrying through the whole diner, and then he turned on his heel and walked out, the door banging behind him. "Well," Rhonda announced, like his behavior proved everything she'd thought about him and more. There were only a handful of customers in the starlight, but they were all buzzing with speculation about the scene. Jack Wexler had clearly made his name in the town, and not in a good way. The question was, Jenna wondered morosely, how much of it was her fault? She didn't want to be the kind of person who created drama. She'd had enough in her life, heaven knew, and she was trying to keep things on a more even keel, especially since she and Zach had had a falling out. They'd managed to recover their relationship, and Jenna hoped it was on its way to being stronger than ever. But this? She really didn't need a Jack Wexler in her life. Jenna glanced once more at the diner's door, firmly closed, dusk settling over Main Street. It seemed, she reflected, she didn't have one. Jack Wexler was nowhere to be seen. Chapter 3. Jack strode down Starr's Falls Main Street, his heart pounding with fury as he reflexively clenched and unclenched his fists. It was so obvious what that woman had done back there. She'd gone and badmouthed him to everyone in this town, and all because she'd been rude to him. All right, he might have been a little rude to her, but she'd been downright annoying, and she'd deserve that review. Mostly. Maybe. Jack let out a long breath, doing his best to get his heart rate to slow. God help him, he didn't need another heart attack 3 months after the first one, and he certainly didn't need people like Jenna Miller. He'd learned her name when he'd searched the store up online, making his life even more miserable than it already was. Why had he moved here again? For the rest and relaxation, a chance to recover after losing not just his health, but his business, his life, his whole purpose. And the trouble was, that wasn't an exaggeration, which had been a major part of the problem. Jack let out another long, low breath as he came to a stop in front of his car. Jenna Miller had nailed that. It was this year's Porsche Spyder, definitely a boy toy kind of car, but he'd needed the pick-me-up after his endless hospital stay, and hell, he could afford it. Why not? Although, it had to be said, when parked between a battered sedan and a rusty pickup truck, his flashy convertible was looking a little showy and ridiculous. But so what? He wouldn't apologize for having made money. A lot of money. Even if it had nearly killed him. With a groan, he pressed the key fob, causing the beep of the Porsche unlocking to echo up and down the empty street, its headlights flashing. He slid inside, resting his hands on the leather steering wheel as he took a few more deep breaths. His heart rate was beginning to slow, but now his stomach hurt, both because he was hungry — the food options in Starr's Fall were severely limited — and because he suspected his damned ulcer was flaring up. Again. Just another symptom of the high-stress life he'd reveled in for nearly 20 years. All gone. In one literally heart-stopping second, when he'd collapsed in the middle of the most important business meeting of his life, with the biggest and riskiest company he'd ever invested in about to go public. He'd reaped a multi-million-dollar profit. Not that he'd been able to enjoy that moment of triumph. He'd been in Beth Israel Hospital, getting a stent put in and fighting for his life. Sighing, Jack pressed the ignition, and the Porsche roared to life. He wasn't going to waste another second of his time fuming over Jenna Miller. She'd looked like some kind of crazy cat lady, with her patched overalls and sleeveless plaid shirt, her hair in 2 long auburn braids like she was 16, instead of probably pushing 40. Not that she'd looked middle-aged. There had been something youthful about her golden green eyes, the spattering of freckles across her cheek and nose, and even the overalls hadn't been able to hide her curvy but athletic figure. Geez, why was he thinking like this? About that woman? Clearly, it had been a while since romance or anything like it had been a possibility in his life, if he was checking out women like Jenna Miller. Jack pulled away in the car with a pleasingly loud roar, an effective screw you to the good people of Starr's Fall, who had already decided to kick him to the curb, although, unfortunately, he didn't really have anywhere to go besides home. He'd just bought a $3 million property on Bantam Lake, a few miles outside of town. But from now on, he wouldn't be going into Starr's Fall. Judging from what Jenna Miller had said, Litchfield was more his vibe, even if it was half an hour away. But that didn't solve his problem now, which was that he was hungry. He wasn't about to drive all the way to Litchfield, but he did remember passing a pizza place on the edge of town. Pizza was definitely something he wasn't supposed to eat. His doctor had given him a strict diet to deal with the effects of the ulcer and the heart attack, and Jack had not liked the look of it. It involved a lot of leafy greens, and not nearly enough to disguise them with. Besides, he'd been so good for the last 3 months, sticking to the boring diet, filtering out every temptation and enjoyment in life. One slice of pizza wasn't going to kill him. Hopefully. He pulled into the strip mall outside of Starr's Fall, noting the 2 empty storefronts, as well as the pizza place, which was a hole-in-the-wall joint with bright halogen lighting and a depressing lack of atmosphere. Hopefully he wouldn't get food poisoning. "Wow!" The guy behind the counter greeted him as Jack strode into the place. "Nice ride." "Thanks," Jack said shortly. "I'll take..." He scanned the offerings and then, feeling reckless, said, "1 large pepperoni pizza. Spicy or extra spicy?" "Spicy, please." He didn't have a death wish, despite how much this day had sucked. After his unpleasant encounter at Miller's Mercantile, he'd visited his mother, always a painful occasion, and then gone for a gentle hike, as per the doctor's orders, and ended up getting blisters from his new hiking boots. He'd had to hobble his way to the Starlight, where he'd been hoping for a decent meal. Instead, his day had gone from bad to worse. Well, maybe the pizza would make it better. "You on vacation?" the pizza guy asked. It was a valid assumption, Jack knew, but it still irritated him. "No," he replied, trying for a reasonable tone. "I live here." The guy's eyes widened. He wore a greasy baseball cap backward and sported a very patchy beard.